Welcome to Bottled Petrichor, a podcast dedicated to discussing key topics in Islamic history and thought. In addition to a short lecture at the start of most episodes, we ask our guest experts questions submitted by listeners and allow them to share their thoughts in a safe environment. Please visit our Twitter page for feedback and question submission forms. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm excited to have on today Professor Shady Nasser. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to have this podcast recording with you. And it is my pleasure. So thanks again.
You're absolutely welcome, Professor. We have quite a lot to get through today, so I'll get started right away. But before I do you mind telling the audience a bit about yourself, your research interests, what really got you interested in the study of, the Qur'an, the various readings and stuff like this?
Sure. So currently I am an associate professor of Arabic studies at Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Harvard. This is my fifth year, starting my fifth year. I also completed my PhD dissertation in the same department, 2011-12. And I mostly work on the transmission of the Qur'an generally in a broader sense, and more specific on the variant readings of the Qur'an. I also wrote my dissertation on this topic. And what interested me in the topic, I have been, even before starting my dissertation, I had interest in this topic. Even back in Lebanon when I was studying at the American University of Beirut, I was interested in this topic. I was doing my own readings about it because mostly I was interested in the problem of inimitability of the Qur'an from the literary perspective, i'jaz. And I got into the discipline of qira'at to know what would be the influence of having, this discipline or this field of variant readings and different renditions of the Qur'an on the general theory of literary inimitability. So this is why I got into variant readings in more detail, so that I wanted to have a better and clear idea about the theory of i'jaz from grammatical perspective.
So thank you for that. You're widely regarded as an expert in this field. So again, I'm very fortunate to have you on today. And with that, we could just go ahead and get started.
Sure.
So the first question is, what do we mean when we talk about variant readings? How is the presence of such readings accounted for between Muslims and Western scholars?
Okay, so variant readings, what we call in Arabic qira'at or qira'a, they are different ways of reading certain words in the Quran or even certain phrases. There are different reasons why we have variant readings. We will get to this, I think, later on. But if we want to talk about the differences between Western scholarship / Muslim scholarship on that, I would generally, again, there are many exceptions, to that, but let's say generally, Muslim scholarship would regard variant readings or qira'at to be part of the revelation. And whether they are 7 readings, 10 readings, etc. Again, we will get to this later on. They are considered to be part of the revelation. Generally speaking, in Western scholarship, they do not regard those readings as part of revelation, and they attribute to this phenomena of variations to several to different reasons, whether they are textual reasons, errors in transmission, textual criticism, etc. So we have words in the Quran, many words, expressions, way of recitation that are different from one style to another or from one reading to another. And this is generally speaking what the discipline of qira'at or variant readings is.
Thank you. When did Muslims first start documenting these variant readings?
Okay, so So documentation, realizing that there are variant readings was very early on. So if we examine hadiths, prophetic traditions, we find that they are the phenomena of the existence of variant readings or recitations in different styles or different manners. It existed very early on. How early, we don't know, but it's early. And documenting it is a different thing. A documentation, generally, whether it's variant readings or Arabic sciences or Islamic sciences in general, of course, it was at a later stage. When it comes to qira'at or variant readings, we do know from sources that scholars, probably by the 2nd century Islamic calendar, so let's say 200s, so that would be 800s, around the 800s, mid 9th century, they started writing manuals, compilations of different qira'at or different variant readings. We do have the first complete manual about the systems, the 7 systems of qira'at, is attributed to Ibn Mujahid. I will talk about him also later. And he died in 324, so that would be 936, so 10th century. So that's the first complete, full-fledged manual of detailed documentation of qira'at. Before Ibn Mujahid, there were many manuals and many books that documented qira'at. We lost many of those manuals. Some of them survived in later manuals. So again, if we want to take it from a historical perspective, I would say the 800s, let's say around 800s, 9th century, we started to have the discipline of qira'at as an academic discipline started to attract scholars who were very keen on documenting various readings. Add to that also that the grammarians of the 800s were also interested in qira'at or variant readings. So we also find many a lot of data in early works of grammar like Zajjaj or Farra Ma'an al-Qur'an, for example, who documented also different readings of the Qur'an.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So we have a number of canonical and widely accepted variant readings of the Qur'an. Mm-hmm. And you kind of just touched upon this. So how and when were these variant readings canonized? I know Ibn Mujahid is involved. And really, what methodology was applied to determine whether a variant reading was valid or not?
Sure. Okay, so this is a very complicated question. Not complicated, just the answer would be long. And it's mostly the topic of my dissertation / first book and, the topic also of the second book. So let's say that the main, I would say the mainstream point of view in the Islamic tradition, as I said earlier, that the qira'at or the variant readings, let's talk about now the 7, the canonical, the standard. So they are divine, they are revelation in their entirety, okay? Now, when we examine the tradition, when we examine the sources, we do not find that this idea or this attitude or this conception of qira'at was adopted by all scholars. Okay, and this is why I was interested in pursuing this topic to see when was the idea of considering the 7 qira'at or the 10 qira'at to be divine revelation, to be part of revelation. And it happened to be that this concept was later, and it was not an early concept. Because if we examine the opinions of early scholars, including Ibn Mujahid, including people like Tabari, including people like Zamakhshari, including Ibn Atiyah, all these great exegetes, and we read their comments and their exegesis about some variant readings, which belong to what we know now as canonical readings, we do see that they criticized many of these readings. Some readings were criticized, many readings were criticized, so we don't have a percentage of that. But the notion that all the readings were divine or were authentic, going back to the Prophet, it's not an idea that was adopted by early scholars. So this is why we have to start with the person who started this discipline, who was Ibn Mujahid, the whole concept of the 7 readings. And what happened with Ibn Mujahid, he chose out of many system readings, or what we call eponymous reading. An eponymous reading is a reading that goes back to an eponym, a person. We attribute this reading to him. So we say the reading of Asim, that's an eponymous reading. So he collected out of different eponymous readings or system readings which were circulating in different cities in the Islamic world, and he collected 7. And he did not say that those 7 are canonical, but later on, the Islamic tradition or the tradition of Qira'at started to rely on those 7 readings. People opposed this selection of 7, other people agreed to it. But since that time, we started to have more focus on what we now call the 7 readings. And this is, again, the period of the 300s, mid-4th century Islamic calendar. So that would be 10th century. So since this period and onward, we started to have this notion of certain readings being standard or canonical and other readings are not. And this, again, before Ibn Mujahid, if we read books of grammar, books of exegesis, books on ulum al-Qur'an in general, not ulum al-Qur'an, but things related to Qur'an, we do see that Muslim scholars considered what we now call irregular readings or anomalous, shawaz, to be valid readings. Okay, so this process of considering a reading to be canonical and a reading to be not canonical, it took a long time to crystallize, and it wasn't, a static concept or idea that can easily be found in the Islamic tradition. So again, to summarize the notion of canonical, or what we call mutawatir, maybe I will talk about that later, divine revelation, it's a later idea that cannot be traced back to early Muslims. Now, does that mean that early Muslims didn't think that those readings were revelation? No, they of course thought that the 7 readings or the 10 readings or different readings, that they were more or less revelation. But is it all of them were revelation, or parts of them? Is there a room for rejecting or accepting a reading based on certain criteria? Yes. However, the notion that the whole system reading, the whole eponymous reading, is divine revelation from beginning to end in all its individual variants, in all its principles of recitation, what we call tajweed, that it's divine revelation, that's a later idea that was not adopted by early Muslim scholars.
So thank you for that. And you mentioned that Ibn Mujahid is kind of central in this whole canonization project.
Yeah.
But before Ibn Mujahid, was there any attempt at canonizing the variant readings? Was there a disagreement among scholars contemporaneous with and after Ibn Mujahid with regard to his choice for the canonization? I know we touched upon this earlier.
Sure. So let's first clarify what we mean by canonize, right? So canonize, generally speaking, in this context, we are choosing out of a corpus, of readings. We are selecting a smaller corpus from that bigger corpus and consider it to be standard or to be canonical, right? And then what we deselect is by default is going to be decanonized or considered to be anomalous or irregular, right? So the attempts before Ibn Mujahid, I would say that they were more comprehensive rather than selective. So when someone like Tabari who was, who died, 10, 15 years before Ibn Mujahid, right? There are reports that Ibn Mujahid studied with al-Tabari, but they are not, I don't think they are correct. But let's say that they were in the same time period. So al-Tabari wrote a manual of qira'at on 20 variant readings, right? 20 eponymous readings. We also have manuals before al-Tabari, and let's say 50, 60 years before, on 25 eponymous readings, right? Now, whether these attempts were canonization, in a sense that choosing 20 or 25 out of so many, I cannot know, because we don't have those books, right? And we don't know exactly how many variant readings or system readings were circulating back in the time. However, with Ibn Mujahid, it's different. It is obvious that he is choosing from a broader corpus. He is choosing 7 out of so many. And people during his time and later, they objected to him selecting 7 only. For hundreds of years, people were criticizing him. Why did you choose 7 out of so many other readings, which were also authentic, which were valid, which were even stronger or better than the 7 or some of the 7 readings that he chose? Okay, so that's what, when we talk about canonize, it means, selecting a corpus, making it systematic, making it canonical, and the other corpus, which you did not include, you are considering it by default to be not standard. So before Ibn Mujahid, we didn't have any manual that says there is an attempt to only select a few readings out of a larger corpus. You may now and then find in bibliographical information some manuals or books which say, well, al-qira'ah, the 5 readings of the Amsar, or al-qira'at al-sab'a, or etc. Whether they were authentic or not, it's something that we cannot confirm. So we would say that Ibn Mujahid, also add to that even after Ibn Mujahid, people were always referring to his work as the starting point. So this is also another reason why we start with Ibn Mujahid as the person who's the founder of the 7 readings, and what people called him later on, Musabba al-Sab'a. He is the one who founded the 7. So that's how I think why he was the first. And I don't like also to say someone or something is the first, because I think there is always a group effort in these things. So I would say if he's not the first, he was among the first people who tried to create a canon, a selected canon out of a larger corpus of variant readings that were circulating during that time.
Thank you. And what factors led to this limiting to 7 and his canonization to gain widespread acceptance? Okay, so I think even before Ibn Mujahid, we can read that also in al-Tabari, in his tafsir, in his exegesis. We can also read that in the early works of grammarians, especially al-Farra, from whom al-Tabari benefited greatly. Zajjaj, also al-Akhfash, these early grammarians, we do read in their works that adhering to the consonantal text of what we call the Uthmanic consonantal text of Arabic is very important and crucial, which means that if you have a copy of the Qur'an which deviates in its consonantal outline. Consonantal outline means, the letters themselves. Okay, so the text itself, the consonants, it deviates from the version that Uthman created. Okay, in, let's say, around 40 Hijri. Okay, so that would be 7th century, around 7th century. So then we consider this reading to be Shadh, irregular. So they were very, very adamant on adhering to the consonantal text. So that's a very important criteria. So starting 200s, starting 800s, around 800s AD, 9th century, early 9th century,
to adhere to the rasm. A second criteria would be Arabic grammar. Okay, so the reading should first adhere to the rasm, to the consonantal outline, and it should be grammatical, meaning that it should not violate the rules of eloquence or proper Arabiya or proper Arabic grammar. Now, this one is a little bit, people who studied Arabic grammar know that, you can say whatever you want, some more or less in Arabic, and then you can find a solution for it, We are not talking just about one school of grammar. We're talking about the different opinions of grammarians about how you justify a certain, grammatical anomaly. So, a quick example, anyone who reads, let's say, Al-Fatiha, right? And then now we say Alhamdulillah, right? With a dhamma on Alhamdu, and people say, oh, this is a subject. But then you go to early works of Qira'at, and you find that, many people read Alhamda with a fatha on the dal, and other people read Alhamdi with a kasra on the dal. And they would say, well, this is grammatically not as strong as Alhamdu with, nominative. However, there is a grammatical justification for that. So, the point is, if you are out of grammatical explanation, whether, this specific reading doesn't adhere to any dialect of some Arabic tribe in Arabia, or you make a grammatical trick to justify it, then, you should reject this reading as not being sound or correct. A third, criterion, which is what I called, in my book, is a criterion that changed over time. So early on, they were keen on having a kind of consensus or ijma' on a certain reading. So a certain Quranic reading would be popular in a certain city, and people have a certain consensus, let's say not the consensus, that the majority of people in this specific region, they are reading in this specific way. It seems that this kind of, this condition or this criterion changed, not necessarily replaced, but what overruled it is the idea of having a sound chain of transmission. And this is what I called, making the qira'ah or making qira'at similar to hadith, prophetic tradition. So you need a sound chain of transmission for a qira'ah to be sound. And they let go of the condition of tawatur or ijma' because it's something that you cannot prove. However, what you can prove is if you have a sound chain of transmission. So again, adhering to the consonantal script of the Qur'an, Arabic grammar, so it has to follow the rules of Arabic grammar. And three, early on it was ijma'. There was no such thing as tawatur early on, but let's say an ijma', a consensus. Later on, it became a sound chain of transmission that connects all the readers who transmitted, this specific qira'ah or variant or eponymous reading.
Understood. And I think just before we move on, it's probably important to ask, and I know we're going to touch these different criteria throughout this episode, but I should probably ask. So when we first talk about the consonantal skeleton, was there one uniform consonantal skeleton that everyone is referring to? Or were there multiple consonantal skeletons that could possibly have been used?
So there were, right? So we know that again from the tradition of qira'at. Now, according to the account we have about the collection of the Qur'an, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but when Uthman formed the committee and they copied the sheets of Hafsa, into the first codex, they made copies. Okay. Now, it doesn't tell us, the account, they don't say that they made different copies. They made copies of that, first, if you want, the parent text, and they send it to different cities, to different, capitals of the Islamic world. And the number varies. So we have so many different traditions about the number. Were they 5? there was someone who made a study of all these accounts in the introduction of Kitab al-Muqna by Dani, the editor, and I think she collected all these accounts, and the number of codices or the number of copies which were sent were either 5 or 7 or 8, 9. I think it goes to 11. Okay. Now, we, of course, discover from the discipline of variant readings and early works or by Muslim scholars that there are actually textual differences between those copies. So those copies were not uniform. But however, the arrangement and the syntax, in itself is the same. So all these different copies, they are actually, it is one copy, it is one Qur'an, but they are copied. They were copied and sent, to these different cities. However, there are some differences in them. Now, in the tradition, these differences became part of the qira'ah, became part of the variant reading. So you would have in one, let's say in the Meccan codex, you would have a preposition which is dropped, amin, let's say, which is dropped from the verse. And then this becomes a qira'ah that, for a wisdom that we are not aware of, they chose to drop this min from the Meccan codex. That being said, there are, of course, other Muslim scholars who said, no, they were scribal errors. Ibn Khaldun, for example, if you read in his Muqaddimah, he tells you that the textual differences we have in these codices are scribal errors. You can't just attribute them to, divine revelation, especially that when these, textual differences between the codices are obvious scribal mistakes. Waw, fa, min, prepositions, alifs, all these things that when people are copying, they were, they naturally, drop or add. However, these textual differences, the prepositions, the conjunctions, they became part of the qira'ah. So if you until today, so you listen, to the Meccan reading, let's say in Surah At-Tawbah, Jannatin tajri tahtaha al-anhar, and then you have Jannatin tajri min tahtiha al-anhar. You listen to the Meccan reading, or even you open the Meccan codex and you open any of the other 6 codices, or listen to them, and then you would find amin here, and then you will not find amin there, and it still exists today in our recitation. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. And I think we're going to touch upon this again later on when we talk about kind of the theological elements with regard to the divine protection of the Qur'an. But kind of just briefly before we move on, when it comes to Arabic, it's commonly held that the Qur'an kind of informs Arabic. Mm-hmm. And so if, for example, there is a transmission of one reading which, goes against, quote unquote, proper Arabic, mm-hmm. and yet Arabic also is said to derive from kind of the Qur'an. So how is this reconciled?
Okay, excellent question. This is a very, very important question, and also in our perception or how we were made aware of the role of Arabic and the role of Qur'an, and which one influences the other. Do we use the rules of Arabic grammar to read the Qur'an, or does the Qur'an dictate the rules of Arabic grammar, right? And again, early period and later period, it's very important. I mean, it's very important to realize that Muslims did not hold the same views over the past 1400 years, which is great. You don't want to be static, right? And early on, Muslim scholars, grammarians, exegetes, they were using Arabic grammar in how they understood Arabic grammar based on pre-Islamic poetry, based on early corpus of Arabic literature, to read the Qur'an. And if there are certain verses or certain expressions in the Qur'an which are not grammatical, and it's very obvious to anyone who goes to these early works and reads some of the problematic, grammatical phrases or verses in the Qur'an, that they were struggling with this. Like, this is not good Arabic. How are we going to harmonize, the rules of fasaha or eloquence in Arabic with, these expressions in the Quran. And therefore, many of the early scholars, especially grammarians, they rejected a lot of those readings of the different, because variant readings, again, it's not dialects. There are many variant readings which have to do with reading words in the Quran with different case endings, which means different syntactical arrangement of certain words. And many grammarians, including Sibawayh, who rejected many of these readings based on Arabic grammar. Arabic grammar does not dictate that we read this in the mansub or in the accusative. We should read it, in that way. However, when the whole notion of the readings of the Quran, the 7 readings, the 10 readings, and even the Quran being, of course, the ultimate manifestation of eloquence and balagha and fasaha, theologians, got into the fray, and they started, promulgating the idea that the Quran dictates Arabic grammar. So even if there's something, that you think is not grammatical, it should be grammatical because it is the Quran. And many statements, especially post, I would say, 6th century, 5th, 6th century, I would say 6th century Hijri. So let's say maybe 11th century, 12th century AD, that you would often read in the works of, those theologians or Muslim scholars in general, that we don't heed the opinions of those grammarians like Sibawayh or Abu Ali al-Farisi or al-Khalil, etc. They are grammarians, but we have the Quran. We received its recitation from the Prophet, and it must be true. Right. So again, this I want to call it reciprocal relationship between the Quran and the Arabic grammar. It's very complicated. It's like the egg and the chicken, in a sense. Do we use Arabic rules of Arabic grammar to read the Quran, or do we use the Quran, to modify the rules of Arabic grammar? And it's very difficult, especially when our corpus of early Arabic literature, I'm including Qur'an under literature in the sense that it's a literary document, that the earliest we have is the Qur'an and pre-Islamic poetry. Both of them are very similar, in syntax and vocabulary, etc. So that's a kind of dilemma in that regard. And again, scholars, with respect to their, affiliation, whether you are a grammarian, whether you are an exegete, whether you are a theologian, you would, advance and adopt a different view based on what you think is most suitable for your discipline. So you read the Tabari, you read the Zamakhshari, you read Ibn Atiyah, they were exegetes, and then you clearly find them opposing many of those, not when I say canonical reading, it doesn't mean the whole reading, okay? I'm just talking about many of the individual variant readings which belong to a bigger system of a canonical reading. So, and then you would find statements by them saying this is not grammatical, this is against eloquence, this reader didn't know what he was doing. However, all such opinions disappeared later on. You would never find an exegete post 6th century who would criticize Hamza, Zayyat, or Ibn Amir, or Ibn Kathir or Qumbul. All these readers, they all just became. You have to take the entirety of the reading with all its individual readings, whether they make sense or not grammatically, and then you have to justify them. Because this is your standard. Your standard is the Quran, and from the Quran you make Arabic grammar, and not the other way around. For some of the early exegetes, for them they already had a clear idea what Arabic grammar should be, and this is why they rejected several readings based on the standard.
Understood. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
How was the Quran defined between different people? And how were variant readings used in different fields like law or theology?
Okay. That's one of the problems, that I was facing when I was working on this is exactly this question is how did Muslims define the Qur'an? And then you would say, oh, well, this is easy. It's the Qur'an. Everyone knows it, right? But it doesn't work this way in academic disciplines for Muslim scholars in that sense, because you need to have a very clear definition of a concept so that you build on that. Many of the what I'm calling like usulis, people who wrote in works of usul al-fiqh, they attempted to define the Qur'an and there were many attempts, and then one author of usul al-fiqh would add something to the definition because they realized that there's something missing. So someone would say, well, the Qur'an is the revealed speech that the Prophet received. And then another usuli would say, well, does that mean that prophetic tradition is not revealed? It is also revealed. So let's add another parameter to the definition. We call it the revealed inimitable speech that the Prophet received, to distinguish it from the prophetic tradition, which is revealed, but it's not inimitable. It's not mu'jiz. And then a third scholar would say, well, okay, but the Prophet also received many Qur'an, with many verses of the Qur'an or portions of the Qur'an, which was abrogated. It was taken out according to tradition. So how do we recognize between that which was abrogated and that which was not? And I'm talking here about abrogation that was completely taken out of the text. I'm not talking about just legal abrogation. And then scholars said, okay, well, then we define it by this, mu'jiz, inimitable revelation to the Prophet, which is in Arabic. Again, they added Arabic to distinguish it from other revealed books, the books of the Jews and the Christians, the way they call it, and which is collected between the two covers. And that was the important, parameter between the two covers, which is ma bayna ad-daffatayn in Arabic, which means that which is collected between the two covers in Arabic, revealed to the Prophet, collected, by Uthman, and the majority of Muslims agreed upon, is the Qur'an. Okay, so this is how, let's say, the definition crystallized later on. And this is, very smart and very detailed, because in this way you are going to exclude all the what we call anomalous readings, all the different codices by the companions, which people agree that they were revelations, but then they were abrogated later on. So the reason why some companions disagreed with the collection of Uthman, they said, well, I have a codex and I received the Quran directly from the Prophet. Why are we choosing your codex or your version over my version? And then the answer to that is, well, your version was abrogated, and then we are following this version. So by putting this definition, ma bayna ad-daffatayn, which is between the two covers, as what we call Mushaf al-Imam, which is the main main codex, they excluded anything outside, the text of the Quran, and outside the text of the physical, the paper, of the text. So therefore, and back to the point that we made earlier about variant readings, any variant reading that deviated from this consonantal text is readily considered not to be Quran. Yes, we can use it in tafsir and exegesis. We can use it in fiqh. If you look at let's say Hanafi fiqh, they would still use the irregular or the anomalous reading of Ibn Mas'ud in many legal verdicts. Okay, so it's a kind of saying, okay, well, there must be some kind of divinity, or there must be some kind of authority, for this abrogated verse. It's abrogated. We don't use it in liturgical practices. We should not recite the Quran using it. We should not pray using, those readings. However, we can use it for legal justification. For grammar also it is, used. And this is why, despite the fact that We have those readings outside the two covers were rejected by Muslims as being Qur'an, or no longer Qur'an, to be more accurate. They were Qur'an at a certain point. Okay, and that's what al-Baqillani tells you very clearly. They were Qur'an, they might have been Qur'an at a certain point, but then the consensus of the Ummah, or the companions, it abrogated this. And therefore, we only stick to what we have between the two covers. So most disciplines within the Islamic sciences, theology, fiqh, grammar, Arabic sciences, tafsir, and this is why we have a lot of variant readings, and whether anomalous or canonical in the books of tafsir, because they use it. They want to use as many variant readings as possible to try to interpret the verses correctly. The more, the better. They always wanted more. They never wanted less.
Understood. Thank you so much for that. So what are the aḥruf?
Okay, so no one knows. That's the short answer. So the aḥruf, I would say, according to the hadith, the Qur'an was revealed according to 7 aḥruf. Okay, and in one hadith which deviates from that, says like ثلاثة aḥruf, so 3. If you open any book on qira'at or on ulum al-Qur'an, and then you try to understand what is meant by aḥruf, we have so many different opinions. And as I mentioned before, in my articles and the things I wrote, is that there are more than 30 interpretations of the meaning of harf. No one really knows. Okay. However, what we know is that this hadith is the only legitimate way of justifying the existence of variant readings. If you don't have this hadith, there's no justification whatsoever for the phenomenon of variant readings of the Qur'an. Meaning that why do we have, let's say, early accounts from the time of the Prophet that he was reading in different ways? We don't. Do we have accounts that he was reading, according to this system, and then he suddenly shifted to that system? We don't. The only justification of the existence of variant is this hadith in its different, variations. Two companions, they were in the mosque, they were praying. One companion heard the other reciting the same verse of the Qur'an, different from the way he memorized it. He took the other companion to the Prophet and he told him, you taught me this verse differently. Look at how he's reciting. The Prophet told them both to recite the same verse. They recited. The Prophet said, well, هكذا أنزلت, this is how it was revealed. And for the other companion, yes, this is how it was revealed. The Qur'an was revealed in 7 different aḥruf. So the translation or our understanding of harf, usually we say it's a mode. Different scholars try to, say, well, the aḥruf, all the variant readings we have now is just one harf, and the 6 other aḥruf, they were abrogated. There are different opinions on the matter. Other people even didn't, take the meaning of harf to be related to qira'at whatsoever, and they said that سبعة أحرف, it means, ظاهر, باطن, أمر, nahi, this, prohibition, command, the esoteric meaning, the exoteric meaning of the Qur'an. So even some scholars took that to completely another direction. So in sum, we don't have any clear evidence of what harf means. I'm saying from the Islamic tradition. The only thing we are sure of is that this hadith justifies the existence of variations and variants in the Quran. Some people and some, I wouldn't say scholars, because scholars wouldn't do that, but let's say the lay people, lay not in the meaning of not educated, but they are not educated in the science of qira'at. They equated the 7 qira'at, the 7 variant readings, to the 7 aḥruf. And this is rejected by most scholars. It's just, a coincidence that the 7 aḥruf are equated to the 7 readings. And this is why many scholars criticized Ibn Mujahid for choosing 7. They said, by him choosing 7, he created this kind of doubt or shubha that would make people think that the hadith of Sab'at Ahruf meant the 7 eponymous readings or the canonical readings, which are not.
Thank you. And to be clear, the hadith justifies the presence of variant readings, but does not exactly mean that those variant readings are the 7 aḥruf.
The hadith, I mean, by justification, it means it's the only legitimate way to justify that you can read the Qur'an in different ways, right? Because if you don't have this hadith, you have also other hadith or other group of Muslim scholars who don't like the idea of variant readings, and they say, well, al-Qur'an wahid nazala min al-wahid or nazala min ind al-wahid. It means the Qur'an is one and it was revealed by the one. This whole notion of variant readings, it's nonsense for some of them. So therefore, how do you justify the existence of variant reading, especially when we are not talking about variations that have to do with dialect? We are talking about variations that sometimes change the meaning, variations that, it's very theological in a sense. If you want to say, well, the Quran is the speech of God or the word of God, kalamullah. So, does God speak in variations and in variants? And it's a very, complex and, intertwined theological problem. Therefore, how do you justify or how do you make the existence of variants legitimate is you have this hadith. And this hadith, when the Prophet says that you can read the Quran in this way or in that way, it doesn't tell us the hadith what were the variations. We only, we can guess. But then it became a legitimate way, or it became a way to make the variant readings legitimate instead of people saying, oh, well, those variant readings are just mistakes, or they were, they were created by the Qur'an reciters and they can't be traced back to the Prophet. So that's what I mean by making them legitimate or legitimize, in a sense that you need a prophetic tradition. We don't have anything in the Qur'an that tells you that you can read the Qur'an in 7 ways or in 10 ways or in different ways, but you have a hadith which tells you that variations are possible and you can read the Qur'an in different ways. Now, where those 7 or 10, what the Prophet meant, we don't know, but the Islamic tradition assumes so, since those 7 or 10 readings, or what we call the canonical readings, are traced back to the Prophet, according to the chains of transmission documented in the sources.
Understood. And kind of just to stay here for a bit, sure. Is it surprising at all that there's this, or a number of hadith which talk about the various aḥruf, and yet, despite its importance, or I'm assuming it was an important kind of concept and topic, no one really knows what aḥruf means. And so it kind of seems as if there were these variant readings kind of around, and then now you have a hadith which kind of justifies it, but it's so ambiguous. There's just no way to know what we mean by aḥruf, but we still use it to justify their presence. I mean, is that surprising at all?
Not at all. I mean, it's not surprising because, we do have many. I mean, one of the problems is, this kind of, kind of historical linguistics. What I mean by that is the word harf, was the word harf for the time, in the time of the Prophet, was it clear, for the early Muslims, or was it ambiguous? Okay, so what I mean by that is when later Muslims, for let's say when you read even hadith or the seerah, you would find in many places sometimes they are glossing certain words. I'm just talking about pure lexical words here. A certain word they would gloss it, and that this is scholars in the 9th century or 8th century. So they are glossing a word for their audience, which means that this specific word was understood 200 years, earlier. But then for the audience, let's say, of the 9th century, they don't know the meaning of this word. And then the narrator had to gloss it. And I would say, for the term harf, if we believe that this hadith is not fabricated and it really comes from the Prophet, and the Prophet really said that the Qur'an was revealed in 3 or in 7 aḥruf, the question is, was the term harf ambiguous for the people back then, or it became ambiguous to us or to the people 200 or 300 years later on? So this needs more investigation in the sense of the nuances of the term harf. Now we know that, let's say, from many accounts in the 2nd century, so I would say, 8th century, late 700s, that when you say, well, someone read according to the harf of Ibn Mas'ud, this is clear. Harf Ibn Mas'ud, it means the qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud. So it's synonymous to qira'ah in this specific context. However, when you say that the Qur'an unzila ala sab'at aḥruf, that the Qur'an was revealed in 7 variant readings, that doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when we find that there are more than 7 readings, and some people said, well, the maximum number you could have for one word is 7, sab'at, awjuh, which is not correct, because there are words read in more than 7. Sometimes there are words which are read in 10 or 12 or 13, different ways. And this is why many early scholars, they tried to understand what is meant by harf. They have different scenarios for that. Ibn Qutayba, al-Baqillani, al-Tabari, they try to say, well, it's 7 dialects. The word cannot have more than sab'at awjuh. And this is where the confusion is. So again, it's surprising and not surprising in a sense. Well, it is surprising that if you want to make things clear, so you should, explain what is meant by harf. However, it's not surprising because many of the terms that were used in that period, do we really understand what they really meant? And this goes the same with the Qur'an. There are many words or vocabulary in the Qur'an, which we call gharib or ambiguous, that scholars until today, they don't know exactly what they mean. And this is why you have different interpretations for them. So from a historical perspective, it's not surprising if we assume that what they meant by harf back then is different from our understanding of harf. However, if it's the same, that harf is a qira'ah, well, that's a little bit, problematic, because saying in one hadith that it's 3 aḥruf and saying in another hadith it's 7, and then knowing that, what exactly is meant by harf is unknown, that's something that puzzled Muslim scholars. And again, they would give you different interpretations and different opinions. And at the end, they would end by, Wallahu a'lam. God knows best.
Thank you. And in your opinion, what is the most likely meaning of this tradition?
I really don't have a strong opinion about the specific meaning of harf and that, and I would probably align myself with the group that would say, well, 7 just mean multiple readings, not necessarily 7. But again, that's just, it's not based on, on evidence. It's just based on probably the general understanding of the hadith, or this, specific statement. So I'm not, it's very difficult to really have a strong opinion about this, because just all scenarios are possible. There are scenarios that you can readily exclude because they don't make sense based on data. You say, well, 7 dialects, it doesn't make any sense. When you say that, they are, well, sure, you can say 7 aḥruf means, as we said, al-amr wal-nahi, wal-zahir wal-batin ila akhirih. Sure, that's, a philosophical, / esoteric interpretation. You can't be right or wrong here. But the problem is, when the context of this hadith is basically the dispute between two companions on how to read, right? And this is why many people would exclude, the specific meaning that the hadith has nothing to do with variant readings, and it has to do with esoteric interpretation of the Qur'an, that the Qur'an has 7 layers of meanings, because the context of the hadith is about, variant way of recitation. So I would, for me, the most important, what I'm mostly interested in is why the hadith was circulated, rather than what it really means. And for me, the most important, bit of it is that it is used to legitimize variant readings. And that's, for me, what is important. What exactly harf meant, it's like tawqif, we really don't know. And then we leave it until, something comes up, new sources, a new interpretation, something that, may come from, that period of the first century that would shed more light on the meaning of harf. But as far as I'm concerned, for me, the hadith is just a way to make the tradition or the existence of variant readings legitimate by the Prophet himself. So that's what mostly concerns me.
Understood. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what do we mean when we talk about tawatur? How does this apply to the Qur'an and its transmission?
Okay, so tawatur means that you have a piece of information, an account or something that has been transmitted by so many people who come from different backgrounds, who come from different times, who cannot collude on error. This piece of information or this news or this thing that they are transmitting, it is so common and it's so obvious that it is impossible for this large group of people to conspire, and collude on error. And that's the technical definition of tawatur, which translates to, it's something that is so obvious, it's something that is so true, it's something that cannot be disputed. Okay, so it's like saying, well, the sun rises from the east. That's tawatur. Everyone knows that. Even a young boy or girl would know that. So no one would say, well, the sun will rise from the west, right? It's obvious. Everyone expects, next day that the sun will rise from the east. And this notion was applied to the Qur'an or the transmission of the Qur'an. Because if you prove that something is mutawatir, then you prove that it's absolutely correct, that there's no way to dispute its existence or its veracity. So the concept of tawatur, which was early on, was not used. There was no one in the early period said that the Qur'an was mutawatir. That's the later concept that was applied later on the Qur'an. Even people like Ibn Mujahid or Tabari, they never used this term to describe the Qur'an. It was used by the people of usul al-fiqh and theologians, because you need the Qur'an. The Qur'an is the most important document in Islam, and you derive, it's the first principle, in usul al-fiqh, the first source. And if you don't have an authentic transmitted Qur'an in all its details, then you have a problem. You have a problem from the premise. And therefore, the idea that the Qur'an is mutawatir, that it is transmitted to all Muslims, that all Muslims know it in detail, and there's no way that people will conspire or collude on forging or falsifying or transmitting something that is not in the Qur'an, is impossible. Because when you prove something is mutawatir, then it is necessarily absolute. It imparts what we call necessary knowledge, alim daruri, in usul al-fiqh. So that's what we mean by tawatur. It's something that is transmitted by a large number of people, that it is impossible for anyone to dispute its veracity and authenticity. And this concept was applied to the Qur'an, I would say, with the late maybe 300s 4th century, so probably 10th century, and it just continued in most works of theology and specifically usul al-fiqh.
How does this apply to the variant readings? Can we say that the variant readings are they mutawatir?
Well, this is the problem. The problem is that in early in early works, the concept of qira'at were not explored vis-a-vis tawatur or vis-a-vis their transmission, right? So we are talking about the Qur'an, and that's why back to to go back to our definition of the Qur'an. When scholars define the Qur'an as that revelation, inimitable Arabic revelation that the Prophet received, which is between the two covers, okay? So the essence of it, if you want, or the core, this is the core, this is the Qur'an. How you recite it and how you produce the different sounds of letters in that thing between the two cover, that was not part of the definition. Okay, but again, it is problematic because without that, and I emphasize all the time, this concept. Without variant readings, you cannot read the Quran. Okay, if you don't have variant readings are the only way for anyone to read the Quran. We don't have manuscript tradition or textual tradition in Arabic where early manuscripts of the Quran were transmitted to us fully voweled. All our printed editions of the Quran are based on one of those variant readings. If you remove the tradition of variant readings, you don't have any way of voweling the Quran. Okay, so this is why the variant readings are so important, because without them, you don't have access to the recitation. Well, sure, the variant readings, the 7 or the 10, I would say they may agree on, I don't know, I don't have percentage, the top of my head. So I would say maybe 50%, let's say, of, common words, common pronunciation, among those 7. But you still have a good chunk of 40% with different voweling, different principles of recitation, especially if you go really technical into the different styles of recitation between one reciter and another. They are completely different. So if you don't have those principles of recitation from the discipline of qira'at, you cannot read the Quran. And then you would resort to textual criticism in the Western way, which doesn't apply to the Quran, because we transmitted the Quran orally, we memorized it orally, and when later on, writing and printing took place, you started to write the Quran and you started to put vowels based on the new invention of diacritics. Okay. So again, back to the whole relationship between tawatur and qira'at, the problem was obvious for scholars. How do you bring together the notion that the Quran is mutawatir? Fine, this Quran which you wrote between the two covers is mutawatir. There are no additions, there are no omissions to it. Most Muslims agree to that, except for a few opinions here and there. But let's say the majority of Muslims agree that there are no additions or omissions to the text of the Quran. But then the next step is, how do you read it and how do you perform it? Okay, are those ways of different styles and recitations also mutawatira, also known to everyone? Are the 7 readings or the 10 readings of the Quran as absolute and authentic as the sun is rising from the east? And the answer was obvious to everyone, is no, it is not. Because again, we go back to early sources and we see that Muslim scholars rejected many of those readings and they did not consider them to be of any divine origin. Okay. And when someone like, let's say, Ahmad bin Hanbal, who would say, well, I hate or I despise the reading of Hamza Zayyat, who's one of the 7 canonical readers, or one muhaddith, let's see, who would tell you if you pray behind Hamza, then you have to repeat the prayer, which means that this reading or this style of recitation is bid'ah, is an innovation for them back then in the 300s. okay, and the late 200s. And this is what the problem is. The problem is, are these what now we call them canonical readings or qira'at, were they mutawatira? And for early people, they realized that they were not. And then this is where the intervention of hadith methodology, took place. Because if you prove that something has a sound chain of transmission, you are safe, right? So any hadith, even if it's transmitted by a single chain of transmission, as long as you prove that the chain of transmission is sound, then you are safe. Khalas, as we say, it's over. And therefore, you started to you shifted, from the phenomena of the qira'at or the recitation of the Qur'an, which was a community practice recited by people, in their local communities without chains of transmission, into becoming heavily dependent on chains of transmission. So you pick, and this started with Ibn Mujahid even. He was, between the two. You start picking those manuals of qira'at, Ibn Mujahid and, Ibn Mahran, let's say, and even later on with Ad-Dani and all these qira'at scholars. And then you would find a chain of transmission which connects you to those readers. And once you have a chain of transmission, then the qira'ah is authentic. But then many, people objected to that. Well, okay, fine, you have a sound chain of transmission, but this doesn't mean that it is mutawatira, because the two concepts are contradictory to one another. You can't have tawatur and a sound single chain of transmission. They are completely opposite. You can say that you have a sound chain of transmission, which means that, your hadith is sahih or authentic, but it doesn't mean it is mutawatir. The criteria are completely different. And therefore, and I take always the example of Ibn al-Jazari, who died in the 9th Hijri, right? So 15th century, 1432, I think he died 1432, who at the beginning of his career, he advocated for this concept. He said that the qira'at, of course, they are mutawatira, they are part of the religion. He was going around in his writings, even asking fatwas from Tajuddin al-Subki to consider anyone who rejects the divinity and tawatur of the 7 readings to be a kafir and an unbeliever. But then 20 years later, in his celebrated work, An-Nashr fi al-Qira'at al-Ashr, in his Muqaddimah, he said, well, back in my youth, I thought that the qira'at were mutawatira, but I realized that they are not. They are just transmitted by single chains of transmission. Now, does that mean that they are less reliable? No, not necessarily. If you have a sound chain of transmission, then the content is authentic. But this is the difference between something which is authentic and something which is absolutely authentic or absolutely validated through tawatur. They are completely two different criteria, at least according from the theological and usul al-fiqh perspective. So that's the problem of tawatur, is that you can prove that the Qur'an as a text, as a consonantal text, that it is mutawatir, and that's the opinion of most Muslims, the majority of them, regardless of their theological schools or sectarian inclinations or legal madhab. But when it comes to qira'ah, that's the problem. And the later opinion, it still emphasized that the qira'at should be mutawatira, because if the qira'at are not mutawatira, then what is mutawatir? And that's the problem. Again, I say this again, if you don't have qira'at, if you don't have 7 readings or 10 readings, you don't know how to vocalize the text, you don't know how to read it, you don't have any way of knowing how the principles of recitation operate in the Quranic text. You are just left with a skeleton. Dead skeleton, has no life, and we rely on those readings in order to instill life in this skeletal consonant of the Uthmanic Codex.
What was the nature of transmission like between the Prophet and the companions, and between the companions and each other?
I mean, you have some, not many. You have like some accounts, okay, that because of this problem, they would even, say that, sure, even some of the companions, they did ard, which means that they did an audition, they did review the Quran with the Prophet, and he certified them. And these ahadith, if you take them from a historical perspective, I myself consider them to be not accurate, because they are just a projection of what was happening, in the first century or second century, back to an early period. You always want to create, this kind of sound, a continuous chain of transmission from the Prophet to the readers. The problem is that we don't have information. We don't have information how the Prophet was reciting the Quran. We don't even know what style of reading the Prophet, recited the Quran in. We only have, some expressions or some phrases that, وَكَانَتْ قِرَاءَتُهُ بِالتَّحْقِيقِ, which means, he used to read slowly, or he would, but that's it. We don't really have any description of or the modality in which he was reciting the Quran. Also, an interesting, feature is that we do have a corpus in the Islamic tradition which is called the Qira'at al-Nabi. We do have which is considered, by the way, anomalous. I mean, imagine, the irony here. So you have sound accounts going back to the Prophet about variant readings in which he recited, but then the Islamic tradition considered those readings to be anomalous. Okay, why? For the same reasons we discussed before. Well, those readings might have been Qur'an, but they were abrogated. They don't conform to the skeleton of the Uthmanic Codex, etc., etc. Despite the fact that they were transmitted, and some of them are actually authentic accounts of his readings. It doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter much, what accounts we have on how the Prophet recited, because what matters is how the Muslim community agreed as a majority to transmit and recite the Quranic text. You see? So any accounts that, tell us that the Prophet was sitting and he was just teaching the companions, the Quran from beginning to end in 7 different styles, and that the Prophet was doing, idgham and mad and naql harakat al-hamza and imala and all this stuff, I really think they are, completely ahistorical. And especially when we study, qira'at very closely, and we know that, starting with the 2nd century, the 200s, let's say, late 100s and early 200s AD, Islamic calendar, 800, 900 AD, that many of the recitational styles were developed during that period, and they cannot be traced back to an earlier period. We know that many readers, they developed their own style. We know that many, like someone like Hamza, why did people consider the reading of Hamza to be bid'ah, to be an innovation? Because they probably never heard that before. And probably he came up with a style of recitation that, according to accounts, that it was connected to some of the Salaf. However, other people didn't find it this way. So again, this is the problem here is having those different accounts and trying to come up with a picture that makes sense. Because if you take all these accounts which have conflicting content coming from different people, saying different things, you can't draw a comprehensive picture of what was happening during the time of the Prophet and 100 years later. And therefore, this is where our role is to try to sift through these different accounts, see what styles or what readings might have developed, let's say, with the reciters themselves, and what readings or variant readings might have been traced back to an earlier period, whether to the Prophet or the companions. That's something, unfortunately, because we don't have documentation in that period, and you only have hadith, so you only have to trust the hadith, some of it, or you have to rely on other methods. So I would prefer to rely on other methods, because I don't trust a bit any ahistorical hadith that tells me that the Prophet was, I don't know, reading in imala or assimilation or all these styles which were clearly developed at a later stage.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. So it seems that we cannot say for sure that all recorded variants go back to the Prophet. And yet, despite this, we know that there were many, many recorded variants. People read, in different ways, and different scholars thought, X variant reading is not okay, which another scholar thought maybe was. Mm-hmm. So really, what does this tell us about the nature of transmission of the Qur'an, and how did people square this with the idea that the Qur'an is divinely preserved, maybe, word for word or something like this? And was there any type of contradiction? Is this something that people wrote about and dealt with at all?
Well, I mean, the whole idea of the preservation of the Qur'an, I think it was and is being mishandled, by people from different groups. This idea that the Qur'an is preserved word for word or haraka for haraka, you don't find this kind of opinion in the classical sources. And people will always tell you, well, the Qur'an is preserved, and inna nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. It means it is protected. Well, sure, but let us go to these sources and tell us what does it mean, preservation. So you go to go to any book of exegesis, go to Zamakhshari, go to Tabari, go to Qurtubi, go to any of those tafsir, and then they will never tell you that this verse means that the Qur'an is preserved word for word or haraka bar haraka or harf bar harf. They never say that. All they say, well, the Qur'an is preserved from omission and additions. It's preserved from the devils or the shayateen to add something to it. It's preserved that the shayateen would never take anything from it, right? So this whole notion that it is protected, word by word, it's something that is used, for the masses in a sense. And it's not, based on any academic research, not necessarily Western academic. I'm just talking about even academic research by classical Muslim scholars, because they already knew that when you talk about the Qur'an being preserved word by word or haraka by haraka or etc., that we do have many problems and inconsistencies in the tradition regarding those variant readings. So the general consensus is that the Qur'an is preserved between the two covers. And that's the consensus of all people, of most Muslims. That's what we have preserved. It's preserved between the two covers. Now, how you render this text, okay, of course, you have a group, a large group, which said, oh, well, even the performance, the 7 or 10 readings, they go back to the Prophet. Well, okay, fine. That's a nice theological idea. But then, if we do more research on the topic, do we reach this conclusion? And my conclusion is no, because we do know that many variant readings developed with time, and we can actually trace back when certain readings were circulating. Let's say, some of the readings, we also do know that in those manuals of qira'at, if people read them very closely, they would see that many of the reciters, the canonical readers themselves, the 7, the 10, the rawis, they don't read consistently over the time. They change their reading. They make mistakes. People tell them that, what you are reading is wrong. You should read this way. Sometimes people read on their own behalf. Take, for example, Hafs, right? Most Muslims now read Hafs an Asim. Right, and we'll say Hafs is only reading on behalf of Asim. He's reading what his teacher taught him. This is a sound chain of transmission. So anything that Asim narrated would be the teaching of Asim. Then we go to the manuals of qira'at, let's say, and then we would have, let's say, in a verse which says, Allahu alladhi khalaqakum min da'f, okay, which is with a fatha on the dal. But then you read وقرأ حفص عن نفسه. Okay, so Hafs read on his own behalf, like he attributed this reading to himself. He didn't even say, well, I took it from Asim, min ضعف with a dhamma on the dal. Okay, so then you start questioning how often did readers do that to read a certain qira'ah or a variant and attribute it to himself. So we are fortunate in this case that Hafs said that, I read it on my own behalf and I didn't take it from Asim. But how many other instances we have that readers don't attribute this specific reading, to themselves, especially when if you compare those 7 or 10 readings and you realize how unique each reader is, okay? So let's say you have the great assimilation technique, Al-Idgham al-Kabir by Abu Amr. Was it something that the Prophet performed? So why was only Abu Amr out of all those 10 readers who performed this technique? Let's say the Imala, the A to E shift, which is performed, let's say, by Hamza and Al-Kisai mostly. So why only Hamza? Kisai was more or less the student of Hamza. So why was only Hamza out of all those 7 or 10 readers who performed Imala in, other people performed Imala, but not to the extent of Hamza, okay? So then we start wondering about, these individual styles of people and why many Muslims objected to those styles. Many people objected to the reading of Ibn Amir, of Dimashq. Many people objected to the reading of Hamza. Many people objected to the character of some of those readers, and this is why Muslim scholars, in the classical period, and even later on, they wouldn't tell you that the Qur'an is preserved, haraka by haraka or harf by harf. The Qur'an is preserved. Okay, how you perform it and how you render it, that's another theological issue that has to do with the speech of God and Kalamullah. Is it, and this is why, just a footnote, the Mu'tazila, in a sense, their opinion died out in a sense, but they solved the problem, not necessarily because of the variant, but for other things. They said, well, the Qur'an is created. It's hadith, right? And it means that even those, it would even solve the problem of the different qira'at and different styles, because you would not assume that God would also, recite the Qur'an in those different styles. If the kalam is qadim and it doesn't change with time, so you would assume that God has only one mode of speech and not 7 or 10 different modes. And the Mu'tazila told you, this is why the Qur'an is created as makhluq. It solves at least, one aspect of the problem. So the preservation of the Qur'an, again, the question is, okay, so you say the preservation of the Qur'an. What do you mean by preservation? What do you mean by the word preserve? What do you mean by the Qur'an? And when we say about the preservation of the Qur'an, you're talking about that thing which is collected between the 2 covers. But by definition, you mean the Qur'an during the time of the Prophet was not collected between the 2 covers. So we are assuming something that didn't even exist during the time of the Prophet. If we believe that the Prophet didn't collect the Quran, there are scholars who say that the Prophet did collect the Quran. But let's go with the majority now and say that the Quran was collected during the time of Uthman. So you are saying that the Quran is preserved in harf by harf. I mean, again, from an academic perspective, you are saying that the Quran, in the way that the Prophet received it, it's exactly matched to the way that we are doing our writing system, which is completely false, because you cannot represent the sounds in any language. You cannot represent the sounds, the intonation, the tones exactly in writing. So you are saying that everything in the Quran is preserved in the same way that the Prophet was reciting it, which is completely false. Because you are saying you can say that it is preserved in the way I recite it, but you cannot say it is preserved in the way it is written down, because you could use Arabic to write it down, you could use transliteration, you could use any system, especially when we know that the Arabic script was not developed at all during that time to represent exactly how the Prophet was receiving those sounds or those words. You see? So the problem when we say preservation of the Quran, we have to dissect it a little bit to know what do we mean by preserve, what do you mean by Quran, is it the recited or the written, and is there such a thing as a written Quran? Because the Quran by definition should not be a written document, and it should be a recited document. A footnote to that, I really don't think that the problems of interpretation in the Islamic tradition would really result from variant readings. I mean, take variant readings alone, take variant readings to the side. differences in the Islamic tradition, whether it's in theology or in fiqh or anything, it's not the result of variant readings. So variant readings are not the cause of variations in legal verdicts or variations in theology or sectarian variations. Okay, so they are spices if you want, but they are not really the main reason for that. So I like a statement by Ibn al-Arabi, the jurist, who was discussing those variant readings in one of his books, and he was of course not happy about the fact of those variations. Qumbul qalun, what's this? And then he said, okay, fine, we do have these variations. وهذا لا يغير شيئا في الدين. Right, that's his conclusion. This doesn't change anything, in the foundations, of Islamic religion. And sometimes when I pray, I use this style or I use that style of recitation. So again, I think the whole matter of preservation of the Qur'an as a concept, it's being used in a way that is not accurate. The question itself is not accurate when you say, well, the Quran is preserved. Okay, do you mean that it's preserved between the two covers? There are no additions or omissions to it, in that sense? Well, sure, everyone says that. We don't disagree on that. But then the problem is it preserved in the way it is recited? That's a question mark here, which Muslim scholars who know what they are, talking about, no one would say, well, it is preserved, haraka by haraka or tashkil by tashkil, because they know it's a very problematic, issue to just simply make a verdict like this so easily.
So thank you so much for that. Professor, before we kind of conclude on this topic of the variant recitations, and do you mind telling us what is Shadh? Are there different types of Shadh, and how what's a range of divergence between what's considered Shadh to what we have in our recitations today?
Sure. So Shadh, I think I quickly talked about that earlier. Shadh is anything that is not canonical, right, by definition. So Shadh is anomalous or irregular. It means that it deviates, right, from the consensus. That's by definition. Shadh is something that deviates from the jama'ah, from the group, from the majority or the consensus. So in the discipline of qira'at, Shadh refers to the readings which were not accepted by the Muslim community later on. And I say later on because there are many readings which are now considered shawaz, but in the early period, they were not considered shawaz, right? So shawaz have different, there are different categories of shawaz. So there is a shadh reading which deviates from the consonantal outline of the Qur'an, right? So you have a word which has the complete opposite rasm, the complete opposite form. And that's by definition is shadh. It doesn't agree with the Quran. You have another type of shadh. It agrees. It's the same structure, the same shape. Okay. However, it's a reading of that specific shape, which was not transmitted by authentic chains of transmission. Okay. And this is also shadh. So let's say I go back to the example I gave before about alhamdulillah. So alhamdu is the systematic canonical reading of everyone. However, you have people who read alhamda with a fatha, right? So that would be shadh because it is transmitted by unverified chains of transmission, or by chains of transmission which were not considered to be a majority, by the others. You have the first type, which I said it disagrees with the rasm. You have the reading by Hasan al-Basri, hamdan lillahi. So he removed the alif lam from hamdan, and then he put a tanween on it. Now that's shadh by definition because you remove the alif lam, the definite article, and therefore it deviates from the rest. So shadh, these are the two big categories of of shadh. Again, the most important element I think is deviating from the consensus of the readers at a later stage. Because again, we read earlier manuals of qira'at, we read earlier works, and we do realize that Muslims were actually reciting liturgically, not just using them in tafsir, using what we now call shawad. So let's say Al-Hasan al-Basri, they were people who were reading Al-Hasan al-Basri in the 2nd century, in the 8th century, and then they were certified also by that. There were people who were taking ijazas even, certificates in certain shawad readings, which we are now calling shawad. Even the qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud, which you just referred to, we also read in the sources that despite the codification process by Uthman and the burning or destruction of all the other codices, the reading of Ibn Mas'ud remained in Kufa for at least 100-something years. People were still reading according to the codex of Ibn Mas'ud in Kufa. And Al-A'mash, who was one of the readers in Kufa, his reading is considered to be shadha, irregular or anomalous. He was he inherited, let's say, the qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud. So that's the general definition of shadh in the discipline.
Thank you so much for that. I kind of want to move on to two very important questions. The first is, what do we mean when we talk about the inimitability of the Qur'an? Where does this concept first emerge, and how have Muslim scholars and theologians dealt with this?
Okay, so again, according to different times and different groups of scholars, we have different realizations of what ijaz is. Okay, there are groups of people, of scholar. When I say people, I mean scholars. Okay, so there's a group of scholars who would say, well, ijaz has to do with the hidden, truths and facts in the Qur'an. It has to do with the tashri', with how it organizes society. Other groups say, well, it predicts the future. It tells us about the stories of the ancients. You have these modern theories about the mathematical ijaz in the Qur'an, etc., which has I would say some seeds in earlier works when it talks about hidden truths or etc. However, that being said, I don't want to say the majority here, but I would say a mainstream view of what ijaz came to be is the literary value of the Quran. Okay, that it is so eloquent and it is so beautiful in its arrangement, syntax, choice of words. Brevity, even though it's brief. However, there are you can flesh out the verses and the hidden meanings in those verses, even though it expresses those meanings in very few words. So that's ijaz al-adabi, or the literary value of the Quran in terms of its literary value. And again, there's a little bit of debate among scholars, classical scholars, about the whole challenge verses when the Prophet challenged the pagans of Mecca to produce something similar to the Quran, or produce 10 chapters of the Quran, or a chapter like the Quran. What does it mean? Does it mean that to produce something similar in style, or does it mean to produce something similar in value, or does it mean that they will just never be able to produce anything like this because God will prevent them from that? And that's what group of the Mu'tazila called as-sarfa, means God prevented people, intervened and prevented people from even trying to emulate the Quran. So you have, let's say, back to mainstream. So you have a group saying that even the Quran cannot be emulated, even on the surah level, as short as Surah Al-Kawthar, let's say. Okay, even though it's short, no one can emulate the style. That being said, you have scholars like, let's say, Fakhruddin al-Razi, who would tell you that no, actually people can write something like Surah Al-Kawthar. So what we mean by i'jaz is the inability of people to produce something on a massive scale, not necessarily one verse or two verses or three verses of the Quran. You see, so there are people within the tradition who go extreme to say, well, similar to preservation, right? So the Quran is preserved down to the single letter, to the circle, fatha and kasra and dhamma, and also it is inimitable in every single word or in every single verse in it. And you have other people, who studied also this matter in a more, I would say, a practical, way to say, well, wait a second, can anyone produce something like Surah Al-Kawthar, which is, three verses straightforward? And he said yes, right? And that's Fakhruddin al-Razi. We're not talking about just, some unknown. So again, that's the issue of inimitability here. It's not the parameters of inimitability, let's say. To what extent the Quran is mu'jiz, I would actually go with the notion that as a whole, as a book, and not necessarily just we go after a short surah or a short verse, and how it is related to qira'at. We have, I think, there are two people, if I'm not mistaken, two or three, who wrote short manuals on even i'jaz through the variant readings. Like the variant readings themselves is a manifestation, or manifested in, the theory of i'jaz. So again, different opinions regarding the literary value of the Quran. But I would say, again, the mainstream is that the literary, the structure, the syntax of the Quran, its literary value, it's something that people, human, ins and jinn, people and jinn cannot emulate and cannot produce something similar to.
The final question is, how is the Quran related to poetry?
Okay, so that's again a very complicated topic, which I'm working on recently. Is the formal relationship between Quran and poetry. Now, there has been a lot on Quran and poetry in terms of their the source the source of revelation in Quran and the source of revelation in poetry back in during the time of the Prophet. So the Quran itself referred to the Prophet, or referred to the pagans in Mecca back then, that they accused the Prophet of being a poet, right? Also, they referred to him as being possessed by jinn. He's a poet, or he was a priest, or an oracle. But the most interesting of them is poet. So what did they mean that he was a poet? And there's the traditional idea that poets back then, probably some of them were oracles. The early surahs of the Quran, they do resemble poetry because they use rhyme heavily. They are very poetic poetic. I'm talking about modern poetic imagery. They are lyrical, in their structure. They almost follow a metrical pattern, but not quite. So in a sense that they really have some rhythm to them. And therefore, that's formulaic, if you want, resemblance between Quran and poetry. However, when we talk about relationship in terms of knowledge or discipline, it was made very clear from very early on that in order to understand the Quran, you have to understand Arabic poetry. And I, of course, ascribe to this notion. And I do think that anyone who wants to understand the Quran on a lexical level, I'm not talking now about the esoteric interpretation of it, if you really want to understand it on the Zahir and what it says, in what context you need knowledge of Arabic poetry, because any book of tafsir you open, they always use the help of poetry, whether on the level of syntax or the level of lexical words or grammar. The only way they used to interpret the Qur'an is through Arabic poetry and the regular speech of Arabs. And this is why Qur'an and poetry, they are very intertwined, they are very important to one another. And in order to interpret the Qur'an correctly and even understand its structure, repetition, for example, what do we mean by its oral nature? Why do we have rhythm, in the Quran? Why does the rhythm change every now and then? Understanding Arabic poetry and the features and characteristics of Arabic poetry is very important to that. And no classical scholar. Now, unfortunately, some modern scholars, they would even say, well, you don't even need Arabic to understand the Quran, which is very problematic, to me at least. So, but from the classical perspective, I think anyone who wants to become an exegete or works on Quran, you have to have not just basic literacy of Arabic poetry, but what we call asalib al-Arab, how they use speech, how they use the words, in the way they speak, or in their prose, or more particularly in poetry itself.
Understood. Thank you so much for that, Professor, and thank you for this super informative conversation. I'm very glad to have you on. And before we conclude, I wanted to ask if there are any projects that you're currently working on, recently completed projects that you'd like to tell the audience about.
Oh, thank you as well. I enjoyed having this conversation with you. I continued my work on Qira'at, my second book. It should be coming out next month. It was supposed to come months ago, but unfortunately for the recent situation in the world, it was pushed back. So it's called the second canonization of the Qur'an, Ibn Mujahid and the founding of the 7 readings. So it's a detailed study on the Kitab al-Sab'a by Ibn Mujahid. It studies, it's just like a word-by-word study of the whole book, all the chains of transmission, everything that was said in the book. Plus, I think hopefully that would be useful for for people to to read what we have to say about the transmission of Qira'at, but also read the variants themselves. So there will be a complete comprehensive table of all the variants collected from Ibn Mujahid at the end of the book, with audio material that will be open access to anyone. So you will just basically read and people will listen to the specific variants. So I hope that would be also very helpful. So that hopefully by next month, it should be maybe end of September, beginning of October, it should be out. So I hope so. So we will see.
Yeah. And with that, I'd like to thank you once again and conclude this episode.